The bank lobby buzzed with quiet efficiency as Clint Eastwood stepped up to the counter. Dressed in a worn leather jacket, his steely gaze swept across the room. He was here for a simple transaction, but the young teller behind the counter had other ideas. "I'm sorry, sir, but we need proper identification," the teller said, his tone laced with impatience. Clint pulled out his ID and slid it across the counter. The teller barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "This doesn't look right. You sure it's real?" Clint arched an eyebrow. "Son, I've been using that ID longer than you've been alive." The teller scoffed, looking Clint up and down. "Yeah? And I'm supposed to believe you're Clint Eastwood?" The comment drew the attention of a nearby bank manager, a short, smug man, in a cheap suit. He walked over, looked at the ID, and sneered. "We don't serve frauds here." Clint sighed. "Look, just cash my check and I'll be on my way." The manager narrowed his eyes. "Or what?" Before Clint could respond, the manager's hand shot out, delivering a sharp slap across Clint's face. Gasps echoed through the lobby. A silence settled, thick with tension. Clint didn't flinch. He simply stared, his icy blue eyes locking onto the man who had just made a very bad mistake. "You shouldn't have done that," Clint said, his voice low and steady. The manager smirked. "And why's that?" Before Clint could answer, the doors swung open, and in strode Barron Trump. Tall, composed, and exuding quiet authority, he scanned the scene and immediately spotted Clint. His jaw tightened as he approached the counter. "Mr. Eastwood, is there a problem?" Barron's voice carried through the room like a judge's gavel. The bank manager, suddenly pale, stammered. This man..." Barron cut him off. "You slapped Clint Eastwood?" His tone was flat, but there was a dangerous edge to it. The teller backed away, eyes darting between Barron and his boss. The manager cleared his throat, trying to salvage the situation. "I didn't know who he was. That much is obvious," Barron said coolly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a phone. "I assume you know who I am?" The manager nodded, his forehead glistening with sweat. "Good. Then you know what happens next." The bank's regional director was on the phone within minutes. Apologies poured in, the manager's face drained of color, and Clint Eastwood was swiftly escorted to the VIP lounge. Within the hour, the manager was out of a job. As Clint sipped the complimentary coffee brought to him, Barron sat across from him with a smirk. "I figured you could handle that yourself, but I thought I'd make it easier." Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "Kid, I appreciate it, but next time let me scare him a little first." Barron grinned. "Deal." Clint leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of the coffee. "Not bad," he muttered, glancing at Barron. "Though I prefer something a little stronger." Barron smirked. "I'll make sure they have whiskey ready next time." The bank staff hovered nearby, their nervous glances flickering between Clint and Barron, unsure of what to do next. The regional director himself had rushed down to personally apologize, his forehead beaded with sweat. "Mr. Eastwood, I deeply regret this misunderstanding," the director stammered. "Please allow us to offer something as compensation." Clint waved him off. "Just make sure your staff learn some manners." The director nodded so fast Clint thought his head might pop off. Meanwhile, the former manager was being escorted out of the building, his expression a mix of disbelief and dread. He had started the day thinking he was in charge. Now he was out of a job, all because he let his arrogance get the best of him. Barron turned to Clint. "Want me to handle your transaction? I can make sure everything goes through without any more interruptions." Clint chuckled. "I appreciate it, kid, but I think they'll behave now." He shot a glance at the teller, who quickly straightened up and processed Clint's request with the precision of a soldier under inspection. A few minutes later, Clint took his receipt and pocketed it. He stood up, adjusting his jacket. "Well, that was more excitement than I expected from a bank run." Barron rose as well. "You sure you don't want me to stick around? Make sure no one else forgets who they're dealing with?" Clint smirked. "Nah, I think I got my point across." The two men walked toward the exit, the bank staff parting like the Red Sea as they passed. Just before stepping out, Clint paused and turned back to the nervous onlookers. "Next time," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "Think before you act." With that, Clint and Barron stepped into the sunlight. A sleek black car was waiting at the curb, Barron's driver already holding the door open. Barron nodded toward Clint. "Need a ride?" Clint shook his head. "I like to drive myself." Barron chuckled. "Figured you'd say that." He climbed into the car while Clint walked to his own vehicle, a classic Gran Torino parked a few spots away. As Clint slid into the driver's seat, he took one last look at the bank through the rearview mirror. He smirked, fired up the engine, and pulled away, leaving behind a lesson those bank employees would never forget. As Clint's Gran Torino rumbled down the street, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. He'd been in plenty of standoffs in his lifetime, but that one had been one of the easiest. People like that manager were all the same, full of themselves until they realized they were standing in the wrong man's shadow. A few blocks down, his phone buzzed. He pulled over, flipped it open, and saw a message from Barron. "Next time we go to a bank that knows who they're dealing with. Lunch soon?" Clint smirked and texted back, "Only if you're buying." As he slipped the phone into his pocket, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The slap had left the faintest red mark on his cheek. He shook his head and muttered, "Damn kid got off easy." He shifted the car into gear and peeled onto the highway, the city shrinking in his rearview. There were bigger things to worry about than some punk at a bank. But if there was one thing Clint knew for certain, it was this. Some people learn respect the easy way. Others? They need a lesson, and he had a feeling there'd always be another lesson to teach. As Clint merged onto the open highway, the hum of the engine filled the silence. He had no particular destination, just the road ahead and time to think. The slap didn't bother him. It was the principle of it. Some people had no respect anymore. His phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call. He flipped it open. "Yeah?" Barron's voice came through, calm but with an edge of curiosity. "You still in town?" Clint sighed, gripping the wheel. "For now. Why?" Barron hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Turns out that bank manager wasn't just a cocky idiot. He's got connections, and not the good kind." Clint frowned. "What kind of connections?" "The kind that don't like getting embarrassed," Barron said. "Word is he's been making some calls, trying to make trouble for you." Clint let out a low chuckle. "That a fact?" "Yeah," Barron confirmed. "I've got a few people keeping an eye on it, but I thought you should know." Clint was silent for a moment, watching the road stretch out in front of him. He'd dealt with people like this before, small men who thought they were bigger than they were. They always made the same mistake. "They can try," Clint finally said, "but they won't like what happens if they do." Barron exhaled through the line, almost amused. "That's what I figured you'd say. Just watch your back." "I always do." Clint snapped the phone shut and tossed it onto the passenger seat. His smirk was gone now. His grip on the wheel tightened. If the bank manager wanted to turn this into something bigger, Clint had no problem finishing what had been started. He pressed his foot down on the gas, the Gran Torino roaring as it sped down the highway. One way or another, this wasn't over yet. As Clint sped down the highway, he let out a long breath. He had hoped that slap was the end of it, just another idiot learning a lesson the hard way. But now, if Barron was right, and Barron was usually right, this was about to turn into something bigger. A few miles ahead, a roadside diner caught his eye. The neon sign flickered against the early evening sky, and the lot had just enough cars to keep it from feeling abandoned. Clint pulled in, parked the Gran Torino, and stepped inside. The place smelled like coffee and fried food, the kind of place where truckers and drifters stopped to fill their bellies before the long road ahead. Clint found a booth near the back, ordered a black coffee, and waited. He wasn't waiting for anyone in particular, but trouble had a way of finding him. Sure enough, before he could take a second sip of his coffee, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Two men walked in. They weren't locals. They carried themselves like guys who thought they were dangerous but didn't have the scars to prove it. Suits too tight, shoulders too stiff. Clint didn't need to hear a word to know they were here for him. One of them, a wiry guy with slicked back hair, scanned the room before locking eyes with Clint. He smirked, nudging his bulkier companion. Together, they strode toward his booth. Clint didn't move. Didn't even look surprised. Slick hair leaned against the table. Mr. Eastwood. Heard, you caused quite a scene at the bank today. Clint took a slow sip of coffee. Is that so? The guy you embarrassed, he's got friends, important ones, the man continued. Friends who don't like seeing one of their own humiliated. Clint set his cup down. And what? They sent you two to teach me a lesson? Big guy cracked his knuckles. Something like that. Clint sighed, shaking his head. Tell you what, fellas, I'm feeling generous tonight. Walk out that door and I'll pretend this never happened. Slick hair chuckled. You think you're still Dirty Harry, old man? Clint's expression didn't change. No, he said. I'm worse. Big guy lunged first. Bad decision. Clint's right hand shot up, grabbing the man's wrist mid-swing. With a sharp twist, Big guy yelped in pain. Before Slick hair could react, Clint stood up and drove his fist into his gut, knocking the air out of him. The whole thing lasted less than 5 seconds. By the time the waitress turned around to see what the commotion was, Slick hair was wheezing against the table and Big guy was on his knees, clutching his arm. Clint dropped a few bills on the table. For the coffee, he muttered to the waitress, before stepping over the two groaning men and heading for the door. Outside, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Barron. Told you to watch your back. Need backup? Clint smirked as he slid into the driver's seat of the Gran Torino. Not yet, kid, but this might get fun. He started the engine, knowing one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Clint pulled out of the diner's lot, he kept an eye on the rearview mirror. The two goons were still inside, probably trying to figure out how an old man had just folded them like cheap lawn chairs. He smirked. Amateurs. But Barron was right. This wasn't just about some idiot bank manager anymore. This was about power, about reputation. Some people couldn't handle being put in their place, and they always made the same mistake. They pushed when they should have walked away. Clint's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Yeah? He answered, keeping one hand on the wheel. I looked into it, Barron said. The bank manager, Todd Naylor. He's got connections with some East Coast types. Low level, but desperate to prove themselves. Clint sighed. That explains. The two clowns who just tried to jump me. Barron chuckled. Let me guess, didn't go well for them? Didn't even break a sweat. There was a pause. They won't be the last, Barron said, his voice carrying an edge of warning. Naylor's trying to save face. He's got people looking for you. Clint's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Then I guess I better pay him a visit. First, Barron hummed in approval. I was hoping you'd say that. I've got an address, his house. High-end place in the hills. Want me to meet you there? Clint considered it for a second. Having Barron along might make things smoother, but this was personal. Nah, he finally said. I'll handle it. Barron sighed. All right, but call me if things get out of hand. I'll be watching. Clint smirked. Kid, I am out of hand. With that, he hung up, took a sharp turn and headed toward the hills. Todd Naylor's house was exactly what Clint expected. Too big, too expensive, and completely lacking in character. A sleek security gate blocked the driveway, but Clint wasn't in the mood for formalities. He revved the engine, backed up slightly, then gunned it. The Gran Torino smashed through the gate with a satisfying crash, sending metal flying. Alarms blared as Clint rolled up to the front door. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket, and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. Still, nothing. Clint sighed, took a step back, and kicked the door open with a single well-placed boot. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, aside from the beeping of the security system. The place was all marble floors and overpriced furniture. But Clint wasn't here for a tour. He moved deeper inside, checking room after room until he found Naylor. The man was in his living room, sitting in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey, in one hand and a gun in the other. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He had expected Clint to show up, but not this fast. You can't just break into my house." Naylor stammered, trying to sound tough. Clint smirked. "I just did." Naylor's grip on the gun tightened. "I swear, if you take another step—" Before he could finish, Clint was already moving. In one swift motion, he knocked the gun from Naylor's hand and yanked him up by his collar. "You've been making calls," Clint growled. "Sending idiots after me." Naylor swallowed hard. I had to. You humiliated me," Clint scoffed. "You humiliated yourself." He shoved Naylor back into the chair. "Now here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna call off your little goons. You're gonna forget this ever happened, and you're gonna stop making stupid decisions." Naylor hesitated, his eyes darting around the room like a rat looking for an escape. Clint sighed. "Or, I can make sure you don't get a second chance." Naylor frantically nodded. Okay, I'll call them off." Clint leaned in close. "Good. And if I hear my name come out of your mouth again?" He picked up Naylor's own whiskey glass and took a slow sip before setting it back down. "Next time, I won't be so polite." With that, Clint turned and walked out, leaving Naylor trembling in his chair. As he stepped back into the night, his phone buzzed again. A message from Barron. "Guessing it's handled?" Clint smirked as he slid into the driver's seat. Handled. With a roar of the engine, he disappeared into the darkness. Clint drove through the empty streets, the city lights flickering in his rearview mirror. The night was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He knew men like Todd Naylor, snakes who thought money and connections made them untouchable. But when a real problem knocked on their door, they folded like cheap suits. Still, Clint wasn't stupid. Naylor might have called off his men, but that didn't mean this was over. There was always a loose end somewhere, always someone too proud or too dumb to back down. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Barron. "You sure it's handled? I don't trust that guy." Clint exhaled through his nose. "Neither do I." A few miles later, he pulled up to a roadside motel. It was the kind of place where people checked in under fake names and left before the sun came up. Exactly what he needed. He booked a room, pocketed the key, and headed inside. The walls were thin, the furniture was old, but it didn't matter. He just needed a place to think. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Clint reached into his jacket and pulled out his .44 Magnum. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He checked the chamber, spun it once, then set it on the nightstand. His instincts told him something wasn't right. Sure enough, less than an hour later, he heard it. The faint crunch of footsteps outside his door. Slow, deliberate. Clint didn't move. He just listened. A shadow passed under the door. Then, silence. Whoever was out there wasn't knocking. They were waiting. Clint reached for his gun just as the doorknob turned. The second it started to creak open, he moved. In a single motion, he kicked the door wide, sending a man stumbling backward into the motel's dimly lit parking lot. Another man stood beside him, both of them dressed in dark clothing, guns in hand. Clint didn't hesitate. 2 shots rang out. The first man's gun flew from his grip as he howled in pain, clutching his wrist. The second guy barely had time to react before Clint was on him, slamming his head against the motel wall with a sickening thud. The first man, still clutching his injured hand, looked up in terror as Clint loomed over him, revolver aimed at his chest. "Who sent you?" Clint growled. The man coughed, shaking his head. I don't know. We just got a call. Said to take you out tonight. Double the usual rate." Clint's jaw tightened. Who made the call? The guy hesitated. Bad choice. Clint cocked the hammer. "Don't make me ask again." "Todd Naylor," the man blurted out. "I swear it was him. He said if we finished the job, there'd be more work." Clint exhaled slowly, his suspicions confirmed. Naylor had lied. He had no intention of backing down. The man on the ground whimpered. "Please, I don't want any trouble, man." Clint gave him a cold stare. "Then you shouldn't have come looking for it." With that, he stepped back, lowered his gun, and let the guy scramble to his feet. The second man, still groaning against the wall, wasn't going anywhere. "Here's what's going to happen," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to go back to Naylor and tell him exactly what happened here. Tell him if he tries this again, I won't be as friendly." The injured man nodded frantically before dragging his unconscious partner toward a waiting car. As they sped off into the night, Clint stood there for a moment, the revolver still warm in his hand. Then, with a sigh, he pulled out his phone and sent a message to Barron. "You were right. Naylor just made another mistake." Barron's response came almost instantly. "Want me to handle it?" Clint smirked as he holstered his gun. "No, this one's mine." Tomorrow, Todd Naylor was going to learn what happened when you crossed Clint Eastwood